Hello, and thank you for joining our webcast today on hurricane season 2020 and adaptation lessons learned. I'm Andy Winkler, the Associate Director of our Housing and Infrastructure Project at BPC. As of December 1st, the official end of the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, there have been 31 tropical depressions, of which 30 became tropical storms. 13 became hurricanes, including 6 major hurricanes. While it's still too early to fully understand their collective impact, total aggregated damages for the whole season are expected to exceed $41 billion, and tragically, over 400 lives have been lost. When you couple this with a devastating wildfire season across the western United States and an unrelenting pandemic, we know disaster and emergency responders and resources have been stretched extremely thin. It's in these times that the strengths and vulnerabilities, particularly those of our disaster response framework and system, are really revealed. So our goal today is to reflect a little bit on the extraordinary challenges this year has presented. We hope to learn from the many thoughtful speakers joining us today what policymakers and vulnerable communities should be doing to rebuild and recover, to plan and prepare for the future. So before I introduce our first speaker, I have one little bit of housekeeping. If you're joining us today on YouTube, please use the chat function on the side to submit any questions that you might have at any time during this event. Our team will be keeping an eye on these as we go and pose any questions to today's participants. You can also submit questions via Twitter using hashtag BPC Live or by tweeting at BPC_bipartisan. So let me introduce our first speaker, FEMA's Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation, Eric Letvin. He directs FEMA's pre- and post-disaster mitigation programs, including the very highly anticipated Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC grant program, which is currently open for applications. Eric, we're really thrilled that you can join us. He has a short presentation, and then we'll take some questions from the audience afterwards. So please do submit them to him. Thank you so much for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Andy. You certainly highlighted the challenges we had with the hurricane season this year. Usually we have at the beginning of hurricane season, we get ready, we put out guidance, we update the president on what we think with NOAA jointly as to what we think the hurricane season is going to look like. Certainly this year, though, we had a very challenging hurricane season. We had, as Andy mentioned, 31 tropical and subtropical depressions, 30 named storms, 13 hurricanes, 6 major hurricanes. The second season that we've had to break into the Greek letter storm naming system. Certainly, we were nervous about hurricane season, looking at the forecast that came out of the National Hurricane Center, and knowing that whatever disaster that we're going to be responding to was going to be in the COVID environment, was going to present some unique challenges. So early on, back in May, to try to prepare the emergency management community, federal, state, and local level, we put out some operational guidance, which describes some of the challenges that we thought were going to be posed by COVID-19, highlighting some planning considerations, how we plan to adapt response and recovery plans, and including guidance and shared checklists and resources to support the emergency management community throughout the country. So we try to get out ahead of it and think about what were going to be some of the challenges of responding in the COVID environment, and really try to energize the emergency management community to work together, the whole of community, whole of government. So how do we deliver? So at FEMA, we have 23 different cadres, and those are essentially different teams of people, whether it be legal or external affairs. I manage the mitigation cadre. We're the third largest of the 23 at FEMA. We did a lot to prepare our cadre for hurricane season. We have about 1,200 cadre members. Currently, right now, we have about 481 of them deployed across 44 different disaster events. Just like other federal agencies and state and local governments, we had a lot of procedures to keep our staff safe and to make sure that we effectively deliver our programs in the COVID environment. So there's certainly a lot of protocols at all of our FEMA regional, at all of our joint field offices and facilities, and our regional offices, who really are provide a lot of the direction for response. We're given the directive to use all their local resources before any national assets could be requested or approved. So due to COVID-19, including a lot of the coordination at headquarters, many of the operations went to almost a 100% virtual based on the regional leadership preference and then working with the preferences of the states. So this was a very different environment for us. So rather than send all these people out into the field to staff joint field offices, we really had a skeleton crew of senior leaders at the joint field offices, and we had a lot of those 481 people are working virtually, supporting multiple disaster events. So we are certainly working to collect a lot of those lessons learned about what worked well, what were some of the challenges. But we knew it was going to be a different environment. Recovery operations are obviously still going on in a lot of places, but we think so far we've been effectively delivering our programs, shifting to a virtual environment. So I'm going to talk about, in terms of opportunities for communities to become more resilient and to recover. Just very briefly, I want to talk about our hazard mitigation programs. And traditionally, the way that it has worked in the past is a community, a state would have to have a disaster declaration, and that really turns on the spigot for post-disaster mitigation dollars. So this is how communities can rebuild and fund those tornado safe rooms or those stormwater projects, earthquake retrofits, wildfire defensive space, whatever those projects are that should be reflected in the state and local communities' hazard mitigation plan. Those opportunities post-disaster through our hazard mitigation grant program and our public assistance mitigation grant program. You can see the orange and the blue part of the pie there. Last year, we spent about $1 billion in hazard mitigation assistance, and this is typical of most years. The vast majority of it, 80, 85, even 90 cents on the dollar, goes into dollars that are freed up in the post-disaster environment. So unfortunately, you had to really be hit by a natural disaster in order to have those funds available at the local level, whether it be FEMA or whether it be HUD, Community Development Block Grant dollars. So we have a new pre-disaster mitigation grant program that I'll get to that really tries to flip this around altogether and try to fund more dollars pre-disaster in the less stress environment and really allow communities to act upon the measures that they identified in their local hazard mitigation plans. So I like to be provocative, as a lot of you know, and maybe we didn't talk about this at FEMA quite a bit. This is a record number. Before Harvey, Irma, and Maria, we had about maybe $2 to $3 billion of unobligated post-disaster mitigation grant dollars. That number between the wildfires and Harvey, Irma, Maria is $9.7 billion. Now, a lot of folks get excited when they see this. A lot of these dollars are, quote, spoken for. They're in projects that are working through state capitals or FEMA regional offices. But I have to report these numbers to the White House, and I report these numbers to Congress, and I'm showing that there's almost $10 billion of mitigation dollars out there that are not obligated. Those are projects that could be funded. So that is a huge opportunity. So if you're in one of these states, you want to contact your state hazard mitigation officer. Now, this is a roll-up, so like in Louisiana, that probably represents maybe a dozen different disaster declarations over numerous years. But your state hazard mitigation officer can tell you the story with those unobligated dollars. But from our standpoint, we are committed to building up our capabilities at FEMA and working with the state and local governments to try to get these dollars flowing more quickly and fund better projects that really drive community resiliency. But this is a huge opportunity to make a difference in spending down the dollars that are already out there available to be spent on post-disaster mitigation. So this year with Louisiana was hit a number of times with Delta, Sally, and Laura, Marco, and Zeta. We have already, there's a lot of recovery operations going on in Louisiana right now. FEMA Region 6 is quite active. We have a number of those 480 staff are supporting a lot of the disasters in Louisiana. The good thing is that we funded a lot of mitigation projects in the past, and so we like to go back and look and see what we had funded and how those projects helped avoid damages from these events. So we're trying to break the cycle of loss and document how effective our mitigation projects that we have funded in the past allow these communities to recover and be more resilient. So we're always looking for help from our stakeholders in helping us document where our dollars are spent and how effective they were spent. So briefly, I'm going to talk about our new pre-disaster mitigation grant program called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And rather than waiting for, and Pam Williams can talk about this because she helped create this, one of your panelists coming up, rather than have to wait for an allocation from Congress, an appropriation, what it does, it takes 6% of the federal dollars that are spent on each disaster. So the disasters that happened in Louisiana over the past few months, in about 4 or 5 months, we'll get an estimate of how much federal dollars we spent on individual and public assistance. 6% of that will go into a piggy bank and be used for pre-disaster mitigation projects that are eligible in a competition for the entire country. So we are trying to promote a lot of different policies with this new program. We're trying to promote lifelines, so not just thinking about protecting a certain building from wind, but how do we keep an entire medical campus operational, like the Texas Medical Center was during Hurricane Harvey? How do we promote community resilience? How do we consider green infrastructure and future risk? So that's a brand new program. And right now, where we are in the application phase, there's $500 million available. Those applications are due to FEMA at the end of January of this year. So we are in an open application period. My first word of caution is the applications from the local community are due to a state, tribe, or territory. And a lot of the states, tribes, and territories have deadlines that are before January, the end of January of 2021. So if you do want to apply for pre-disaster mitigation grant funding, please check with your state and find out if there's any state required deadlines ahead of the FEMA deadline. So right now we're looking to spend that $500 million on the best projects that we can. So of that $500 million, almost the vast majority of it, 446, is going to go into a national competition of projects. There's going to be $20 million for a state set aside. A tribal set aside, and then each state and territory receives about $600,000 that can be used for planning, management costs, and also capability and capacity building issues. So I'm pretty much out of time. I just want to close. Certainly, we're trying to capture a lot of the lessons learned during this hurricane season. A lot of we've had to shift to a completely virtual training environment, for example. Those roles, responsibilities are always critical between the federal, state, and local government, and trying to collect what worked well, what was a challenge, and how do we continually improve the way that we deliver our programs. So why don't I end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. So right now I want to remind audience members to please submit questions if you have them for Eric. We have a few minutes to cover anything that you might have on your mind. I did want to start with a sort of an opening follow-up question for you. When you talk about breaking the cycle of loss, you mentioned a couple different programs that have money that local communities can start to access, that they can apply for. But amid this really challenging pandemic, the economic impact that it has had, so many communities are capacity strained from a staff level, but also, their budgets have been totally decimated in some communities. So what advice do you have for them as they look towards these sort of pots of money that you say are out there, but who really do not have the staff at this moment to plan large scale, mitigation projects, to do the staff time to get those ready? What is your advice for them?
It's a great question, and we're hearing that over and over. A lot of the folks that we typically work with that may be working mitigation at the state or local level are still working COVID-related activities, and so they're resource constrained. So I would say, if you have a project that you want to implement, and maybe you don't have the time to submit a full application for the larger project, like we have something called project scoping, where you can apply for a much smaller amount to allow you to help plan out or hire a local engineer or what have you to figure out if this project is really going to be viable. So you don't have to go in for a full project. You can go in for some seed funding or some technical assistance to really help you along. But we're certainly hearing from a lot of communities that they just simply don't have the time to apply for a grant right now, let alone administer a grant. So we actually just held a cost share webinar over the summer looking for different organizations, NGOs or what have you, that are willing to step up and help communities with this process.
Great. So I'll turn it to one question we have submitted from Tom Frank. He asks, why is so much HMGP money unspent? What is FEMA doing, or can it get states to spend more of what is available?
It's a great question. There is a story behind every particular disaster. Sometimes the projects are what we call phase projects. Like, we're actually still spending money from Hurricane Katrina, where a certain part of a project has to be spent first before the next phase is spent. So those monies are spoken for, but the monies aren't exactly obligated. A lot of times it has to, if you ask that question with the wildfires in California versus Harvey in Texas versus an ice storm in Massachusetts versus Puerto Rico, there's going to be a different story. A lot of it has to do with the capacity and capability of the local community or the state. Sometimes there's challenges on our end in our regional offices. So we certainly own a lot of that. We are trying to supplement our FEMA team with contractors to help us really drive these projects forward and provide a lot of technical assistance to state and local governments to allow them to get these dollars flowing, because they directly help recovery.
Great. So another question from the audience we have. So what were the politics or disagreements between Republicans and Democrat policymakers when developing the BRIC program? I would expand that to say, I know you're getting a lot of pressure over the amounts of BRIC money being spent. And this kind of relates to my first question about capacity at the local level. How should people be planning about the amount of money that could be coming, not this year, but next year and years past, if they don't have the time to be able to put their projects together now? Have you gotten a lot of support, a lot of comments from both sides of the aisle about this program?
In terms of the first question on creating the program, I mean, I'm in the executive branch, so we don't get involved with, other than providing technical drafting assistance when asked, we don't get involved with the different debates. I know Pam Williams, who's on your panel, who helped write the legislation, would be an excellent person to answer that question as to the politics of it, because I don't have any insights as to the things that were on the table and off the table in the final legislation. So Andy, the second part of your question was in terms of the amounts. I mean, the amount says up to 6%, and it's really the challenging part of BRIC is we don't know exactly how much money we're going to have each year, and that was by design, right? So if we had a very slow disaster year, we predicted, if you go back and look historically, BRIC may only have like 130, 150 million dollars. In fact, back in March, we thought it was going to be maybe 200, 250, and then we had declarations in every single state and territory, the first time that probably had ever happened for COVID back in March. And then we got the 6-month lock-in in September. So BRIC by nature is going to be up and down. What we're trying to do is look at, if we had a large BRIC year like Harvey, Irma, Maria, we would have had $3 billion go into BRIC. So if we did have a year like that, how could we take that $3 billion and try to provide some stability to the program where state and local governments would know there's roughly going to be, X amount of dollars each year. So we're certainly working through funding stabilization scenarios for the program.
And for those people who are a little less familiar with BRIC still, I know there are many groups who are pushing their local communities to try to get those funds. But for those who are still hearing about it for the first time, can you just mention once again, the kinds of communities that are eligible for this funding? I know we've talked about before that a lot of the communities who have invested in mitigation, who have taken breaking that pattern of loss, as you say, seriously, are those who have already been hit by natural disasters. But as we know, with our changing climate, there are communities that will be vulnerable to severe and dramatic storms for maybe the first time, who haven't had a long history of flooding, but might in the future. So can you talk a little bit about what those communities who may not fully appreciate the risks that they have should be starting to look at and think about in planning for the future?
Certainly. So, if you're a citizen or an interested party, try to find your local community's hazard mitigation plan very often, or the state. Very often they're up on the web, and that outlines what the vulnerabilities are in that community to the various hazards and what the community plans to do about them in the long term. So you are required to have a hazard mitigation plan at the time of award. But now that we've had, the way the legislation goes, now that we've had disaster declarations in all 50 states and territories, pretty much every community in the United States is eligible for BRIC funding. So there's no real eligibility requirements other than by the time we actually make the award, they have to have an updated hazard mitigation plan. They are required to be updated every 5 years. Sometimes they come out of date and they need to be refreshed, but pretty much any community is eligible for it. It's just a matter of it's a 75-25 match. And a lot of times the challenge is, where's that 25% going to come from, especially in this environment that we're in now where local governments don't have maybe the funding that they thought a year ago. They're starting to cut staff or cut capital improvement projects. The local match is certainly a challenge for a lot of folks.
Great. So I know we're about up with time, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least say thank you to you and to all of the tireless work being done at FEMA, not just in DC, but across our country. I think people do not fully appreciate the challenge of implementing a nationwide pandemic response on top of one of the most historic and record-setting hurricane seasons that we've ever had. So I know so many volunteers and workers go into some of these operations and put their health and safety at risk, frankly. So thank you to you and all of the work that you do. And if you have any final thoughts, I'll leave it to you.
No, thank you very much. It's a whole community, whole of government. So it's not FEMA. It's all the people, federal, state, and local governments, and all the volunteers and supporting contractors and NGOs, faith-based organizations. It's really, there's a lot of people involved, and it wouldn't work unless everybody's working together. And we're all really trying to deliver our programs the best way that we can, but also trying to stay safe. So we think so far it's gone pretty well, but man, there's a lot of things we have to document and try to continually improve upon.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Eric. And audience members who have questions, still feel free to submit them. We'll be checking throughout. Some of the panelists later may be able to answer them, or we'll make sure that they get to FEMA and Eric. so that you get all of the questions that you have answered. So thank you so much, Eric. I'm next going to turn it over to Melissa Roberts at the American Flood Coalition. She is a close partner of BPC's and a fantastic ally on adaptation policy and resilience. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks for moderating.
Great. Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Flood Coalition. We're a nonpartisan coalition of folks on the front lines of flooding. So cities and towns, elected officials at all levels, military leaders, businesses, and civic groups advancing solutions to flooding and sea level rise. And with 250 members across 19 states, the impact of this hurricane season was felt deeply by many of our coalition members. Eric outlined some of the staggering statistics from this hurricane season, which set multiple records. But I think it's important as we move into this panel to really think about this as part of a trend that we've seen for years of higher seas, stronger storms, and more frequent flooding that's been evident for a long time and goes hand in hand with more intense and destructive fires we've also seen this year. So given all the unprecedented challenges we faced and the hurricane season concluding this week, I'm grateful to be here today with our panelists and with all of you listening. So to do brief introductions for our panelists and then let themselves talk about their work in their own words, I'd like to introduce Pam Williams, the Executive Director of the Build Strong Coalition and a member of the National Advisory Council for FEMA. Jeff Byard, the Vice President of Government Relations and Emergency Management for Team Rubicon, and formerly FEMA's Associate Administrator for the Office of Response and Recovery, and Yvette Chen, a Planning and Policy Analyst at Fair Share Housing Center, which is the only public interest organization entirely devoted to defending the housing rights of New Jersey's poor. So let's get started, and for everyone in the audience, think about and submit questions, which we'll have time for at the end. So to kick us off, I'd love to ask each of you to weigh in from, your different policy expertise areas. We have expertise from housing to emergency management to building codes, but to kick us off, can you each just take a couple minutes to explain to the audience first what you do and then how this hurricane season has impacted your work? And why don't we start, Pam, with you?
Excellent. Thank you so very, very much, Melissa. So as the Executive Director of the Build Strong Coalition, I am leading a very diverse group of people that represent emergency managers, as well as code officials, engineers, materials folks, architects, that are very vested in building resilience across the United States. And I say that because it was so important to bring some of these diverse stakeholders to the table, particularly in the wake of the 2017 storms cycle, to bring perspectives and data and truly help policymakers understand the critical situation that we are in with rising disaster costs and losses. We are on an untenable trajectory, and how do we tackle that? How do we tackle being able to invest upfront to draw down those disaster costs and losses? So as we look at this tremendous hurricane season, as we heard, it was record-breaking. And to amidst the COVID environment has taught us many things about the importance of our stakeholder communities, about how to be creative, about how to leverage resources, as Eric said, from the entire community. So I'm glad that Build Strong has been able to be a part of that community in helping educate folks on the risks that they face, and hopefully helping build capacity and capabilities at the state and local level to successfully implement mitigation and resilience strategies.
Great. And Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about your work?
Panel, appreciate the opportunity from BPC and glad to be on the panel with Yvette and Pam. And it was good to see Eric and some others from my FEMA days. So My current position with Team Rubicon is the Vice President of Government Relations and Emergency Management. I began in February with the team after a good time at FEMA. We're going to be, establishing our office here in the DC area. Actually, we've been able to get the function fairly stabilized. So I'll be making a move in January to oversee our domestic operations. So, which is good. I'm excited about that. This hurricane season, this COVID season, and a little bit about Team Rubicon. We're fairly new. We've been around for 10 years. We're predominantly a veteran-led organization. We have 137,000 gray shirts, which I'm wearing today, which is our uniform, volunteers across the country. We have about 200 full-time employees between LA, which is our headquarters. Our National Operations Center is in Dallas, and then we'll be opening the DC office here very, very soon, or when we can get to that, given the current situation. So, we're traditionally a disaster response organization, traditionally, dealing with natural disasters. So, how we adapted quickly to COVID, we've been able to deliver about 80,000 COVID tests and actually administer about 8,800 COVID tests across the country in partnership with governments and certain entities. One of our biggest missions that we're continuing, we're back in today, is out in the Navajo Nation in Arizona, helping with medical support for just a tremendous amount of need. Shifting into hurricane season, I was able to implement some initiatives. One of those is speed to need. How do we speed our gray shirts to meet the needs? So deployed to Hurricane Laura, pre-landfall, Hurricane Sally, Hurricane, one of the Greek alphabets, I think it was Beta, all pre-landfall, all in the same general area. So we were able to get our gray shirts on the ground in coordination with Lake Charles, Calcasieu Parish, Jefferson Davis Parish, Baldwin County over in Alabama. Very, very quick. And coordination is the key to that. I think, and I'll have some later discussions on that. But just some quick impacts that you don't think about, right? We assisted Feeding America in over 200 food banks because of the age of their volunteers. So, and we also have a large amount of our volunteers are at the at-risk environment. So we made a decision early on that first and foremost, we're going to protect our volunteers. We're going to protect the communities we serve and then the communities we go back to. So, it did impact us. Where we could have 4 volunteers in a truck, we had 2. Where we could sleep 30 volunteers in an area, due to social distancing, we had to, maximize our space. So it's been a challenging year, but that's what we do, right? That's the business we're in. We are the entities on the panel, FEMA, and all of us that are here to deal with a complex problem. So it's been a challenge, but it's been a learning curve, but I'm convinced we'll come out of it as a system better and stronger.
Absolutely. And Yvette, how have you thought about this in your work, and what have been the impacts on housing?
Yvette Chen, thank you guys for having me on this panel, and I'm learning a lot always. So I can just start off by talking about how we kind of got into this work. So Fair Share Housing specifically works on affordable housing throughout the state of New Jersey. But in October 2012, after Hurricane Sandy, we basically had an unprecedented access to FEMA data, and we were able to show key issues and an unfair treatment of renters versus homeowners, because the state was proposing about 22% of resources would go to renters when it was really like 40% of renters that were affected. And so in April of 2013, we worked with the Latino Action Network and New Jersey NAACP to file a complaint. And we sent that to Secretary Donovan, the HUD secretary at the time, to ask for changes to the plan. And so this led to a reallocation of about $40 million in funding for low and moderate income homeowners that were missed, and a re-review of applications for homeowners that were wrongly denied. And so since then, we've been involved in conversations around disaster recovery and advocating for data transparency and working on the national level mostly with other groups throughout the country, including groups in Texas and Puerto Rico, on how we can make structural changes to disaster recovery and preparedness. And so right now, obviously, there's just so many overlapping disasters, and on a daily basis, we have a lot of people at Fair Share working on the eviction moratorium, and just knowing that the hurricane season is coming, and we also already have COVID, people losing their homes. And then there's a new study that I saw about how affordable housing vulnerable to coastal flooding is set to triple over the next 30 years. So we're trying to take a larger view of the entire system and see how these slow building disasters in historically marginalized communities are going to lead to even bigger disasters with COVID and the hurricane season. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk more about how we can use data, and really, because we have a civil rights background, I think we approach a lot of these issues from how we can use things like equity impact analyses and layer in a lot of different types of data to understand how to both recover and also, prepare for incoming disasters.
So, Jeff, you mentioned coming out of this stronger, and Yvette, you mentioned structural changes that will be needed going forward. So, picking up on those themes, I'd love to ask each of you to reflect on kind of the overarching strengths and weaknesses that were revealed by this dual disaster scenario of having COVID and the pandemic and the economic recession layered on top of this active flooding, wildfire, and storm system. What does this tell us about where we need to go next?
Yvette, I'm happy.
Yeah, Jeff, do you want to kick us off? Yeah.
I can go first, Jeff.
Great.
So we actually worked with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and my colleagues Adam and Dave Ramler wrote a report with them called Fixing. It was released this summer. I can post a link to it, called Fixing America's Broken Disaster Housing Recovery System. And a lot of it is around a broader reform for disaster assistance that would address those with the greatest needs, and focusing on mitigation and resilience and less on after the fact responses. And also just restructuring things so that various agencies like FEMA and HUD have a more standardized process to apply for assistance, and similarly a standardized process in understanding how they make their decisions, and also one place where we would have all the data on these people and the disaster impacts. So because we had access to that data set after Hurricane Sandy, and we were able to really analyze things on a granular level, understanding like neighborhood effects, race, income, things like that. I think these data are really important to have in one place, and to have be ready to analyze things through an equity lens.
Yeah, and I would, add to that a couple of things. When you think about coming out of disasters or hazards stronger, once you go through it, you now have a mental base, right? Hey, we've done this, or this happened, but we know we know it can do this. COVID is a worldwide pandemic, but as we saw, it didn't stop a hurricane. Hurricanes don't care. Tornadoes don't care if there's a worldwide pandemic. Floods definitely don't care if there's a worldwide pandemic. So, you have to look at how do you manage that, because it's coming. And in this case, it was a historic hurricane season. So, I think when you look at after we come out of COVID, one of the hopes that I would have is a truly all hazard system. I mean, we have great people in our public health system, and they do tremendous work. But when you look at the emergency management discipline in the system, the logistics that it takes to move things, and it doesn't matter what you're moving things. It doesn't matter the information you're pushing, you're pushing information. So, I really hope that as we face future disasters in our country, and in the world for that matter, we utilize the systems that we have and do tweaks. We don't look at trying to create well, we'll use this system for this type of disaster. Then, if it's really big, we'll go to this system over here. It just totally confuses state and local governments, and it further confuses the citizens. Who do they listen to? They listen to the emergency manager. They listen to the public health director. They listen to the governor. And we're Americans. At the end of the day, we're going to say, you know what, I'm going to listen to my best advice, and we're going to make decisions. And that's not always the best. So I think that we have to be better coordinated. And then we also have to look at all the players that can help. It's not a total government solution. We started it in FEMA, and it wasn't, I'm not saying it's me, it was FEMA, of really understanding the private sector, the tremendous capability and capacity that the private sector brings to the table. We saw that in some of the logistics that FEMA implemented, which was great. But we have to look at every resource in the toolbox and almost create like a disaster prime. You go on Amazon Prime, you find what you need and you plug it in. A survivor goes on there, and if they need tarp and they need this, who can provide that? Who can provide that? How do we make it as easy as possible? Because we're asking folks that just went through the worst possible time in their life to make tremendous amounts of decisions. And we've got to figure that out. And I think we will, and I think we have. I think FEMA's made strides in the IA program. And then think about it in terms of, from the infrastructure side of it, from the public assistance side of it. This is money that the local governments, they shouldn't have to work so hard to get money that is by law theirs, right? They have eligible damage. The money's there. Let's get the money in the hands to it. It shouldn't be, years and years and years of really having to work hard and spend money to get money that has already legally been obligated to those eligible applicants. But I do think we'll come out of it stronger. We always do. That's what we are as a country.
Things that both Yvette and Jeff said. I think if anything, COVID taught us that one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure are our homes. Homes are shelter. And FEMA, during Jeff's tenure there, developed this amazing operational framework, which focuses on Lifeline. Eric showed us those earlier today. So we're able to focus on the provision of water, power, and key things like food and shelter. And so one of the things that we have been very, very focused on and actually found some tremendous successes with during this hurricane season was investments in residential resilience. So I'm going to say this tagline, it's not mine, but building codes save lives. The highest adopted building codes are promulgated through a consensus-based system and drive resilient construction. And thankfully, we now have states that are engaging in great retrofitting programs. And so I want to highlight one of those. One of those is the great state of Alabama. And they have put resilient roofs, the fortified roof, on thousands of homes. And guess what? In Hurricane Sandy, thousands of these homes were impacted and not one had a critical failure. And that's what we are learning. And I would say to pounce on Yvette's data, one of the things that we are continuing to find is that through these impactful events, we're finding risk exposure, but we're also finding what works. We're finding those lessons learned, those best practices. And thankfully, we are also driving federal resources to leverage incentives so that people can continue to invest in resilience. So I just think that that's one of the most exciting things that we've learned is the exposure that we have and what we can do to realize immediate and dramatic impacts in our resilience today.
Yeah, that's a great example, Pam. And actually picking up on that, I know on this panel, we're all big advocates for investing before disaster strikes and in pre-disaster mitigation. And I'd love to hear some examples from your own work in ways like the one you gave, Pam, of good ideas of how to make this work better. Because I think, a lot of us here spend our days saying we need to invest before disaster strikes. It's easy to say, but what are some of the ways that this either tangibly could work better or is already working that we need to be able to expand and promote?
I'll jump in, and I just want to kind of echo what Pam just said. Is we all experience. I mean, I'm in my basement office now, right? And my children are upstairs at their home school now, and my wife's and working. And home is everything to us. Some of the measures that Pam just laid out are very inexpensive, right? Fortifying a roof after a disaster, it's not, you're looking at $300 to $500 increase in the building costs, and you're saving your roof, which if you save your roof, you don't necessarily go to a shelter. So you don't necessarily tax, an already overburdened system. So I look at that. I go back to the lifelines, from the emergency management community. If we can keep the power on, that's 90% of the battle. And to me, and I know we've got, I know the laws guide this, and I'm not saying right or wrong, but then we got a battle. Is it a for-profit power provider? Is it a co-op power provider? Let's keep the power. Let's commit to look, keeping the water going and keeping the power on. Then you could shift that think of it, if you shifted that FEMA machine that is outstanding to really just focusing on the individual survivors. Right. I mean, what kind of speed to need could we provide through that by simply investing to keep the power on, keep the water on? But it takes a lot more. I'm not just saying that that's a FEMA, issue or a state issue. We've got to commit to that as a country as a whole to look at keeping power on, keeping water on, fortifying, like Pam said, and you really, then you can focus on those specific needs. So I think, looking at the lifelines, looking at not just individual projects, but projects that have interdependencies to other projects to keep that lifeline going is the way we should go.
Well, and I think Eric touched on this right up front. It's understanding our risk exposure. And one of the most important tools to doing that is the insurance industry. I worked a tremendous amount with the insurance industry. This is something that they are very, very interested in. And actually, it's one of FEMA's strategic priorities is how do we bridge this gap in insurance within our communities and within individuals that are completely unaware of the risks and hazards that are likely to come their way and are wholly unprepared and unprotected for those risks. And I think as Jeff and Yvette have perfectly highlighted, this is a system. We can't just reinforce a power pole. We can't just protect a levee. This has got to be an intricate network of all stakeholders, not just government, of the public sector, private sector, nonprofits, for-profits. One of the best things that we learned during this hurricane season was how the private sector can step up to provide the resources that a community needs. They are just as invested in the success and resilience of that community as anyone. And often they can provide so many more resources in a different, creative way than the federal government is able to. And those are some of these things that we have learned that we need to absolutely continue to educate and promote so that people can plagiarize this, take these states that have been successful and copy what they are doing. Let's have a competition between states on who can do this the best. I always like a good, healthy competition.
I guess I would just
anything
add,
you want to,
yeah. Right on cue. Didn't even plan that. Yeah, I really like what Pam said about having everybody involved. And I think something I've been thinking a lot about since the pandemic, and I live in Philly, is just like all these alternative ways that people are stepping up on a community level to work together and provide things like food. So I think a big part of it is also that there are existing community institutions, and communities need to have a leading role in developing these plans. And a lot of these networks between like neighborhoods and community-based organizations already exist. So they also deserve a seat at the table in developing a model around community response that can inform governments, the private sector, the public sector, and thinking about things like how we can disseminate supplies or create a recovery plan. It should be done on a very holistic scale where everybody is involved. So yeah.
And Pam, I'll direct this question first to you and then let the other panelists jump in. But these ideas we're talking about really are not just coming from the federal government. They require the buy-in of state governments, as you mentioned, local governments, and community members. So what best practices have you seen in terms of getting that sort of partnership, both at the federal and state level working together and getting broader community buy-in?
So you also just highlighted one of the most important aspects to this conversation, education, and the fact that one size will never fit all. We have so many beautifully diverse communities and states throughout this country. And unfortunately, there isn't going to be a rifle shot or a panacea that solves a hazard problem for everyone. The way California experiences wildfires and earthquakes is very different than the way Alabama or a New Madrid might experience an earthquake. So these have to be very, very intimate, tailored discussions and strategy sessions amongst everyone involved in the community. So one of the best practices that I have seen is at the state level, when they break down all of these stovepipes and bring together people that, guess what, have never sat across the table from each other. The emergency managers have never met with the Department of Insurance. They've never met with the community development folks that are managing all of the CDBG HUD funding. They've never met with their Department of Energy that's managing resilience funds for the grid. They've never met with their EPA folks that are dealing with water issues. And so for the first time, we are seeing governors say, look, this is a cross-discipline issue. There are many resources available. And if we aren't smart with how we implement and explore those resources, we will continue to be behind the eight ball when it comes to resilience and disaster risks. I think the city of New York did one of the most amazing things possible in the wake of Sandy. They leveraged all of the lines of investment and they timed it out so that they could maximize the investment that was occurring. Now, we all know that New York City OMB is bigger than most countries' governments. So most communities don't have those resources. So what community resources can you leverage to help, whether it's just getting to the point of adopting building codes in your community? There are tremendous community partners that can leverage the politics, that can leverage the education. And then there are other community partners that can bring resources to bear, whether that's through a cost share, in-kind services, donated land, property services. You just have to get creative. And one of the things that I have said time and time again, FEMA has given us the opportunity to be so creative and to force FEMA to tell us, why can't it be done? Why can't it? If not us, then who? We have the ability to be tremendously creative, to bring together partnerships, and the private sector wants to be at this table. They are wholly invested in this conversation and they look at it through different lenses. We can no longer look at this myopically through the FEMA federal government lens.
Jeff, is that anything you guys want to add on there about how you can really foster this sort of innovation and best practices at the intersection of, state and federal governments, state and local governments, or local governments and communities?
Yeah, a couple of things, and I'll go off Pam, and I'll be real quick because I know Yvette's probably a better expert at that than I am. But I think you look back to everything, all disasters beginning in locally. So it's got to be locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. To Pam's point, FEMA is given leeway. I look at it from a different lens on the public assistance side. $11.5 billion project obligated within 3 years of a disaster, albeit recovery's never quick enough. I get that. We got beat over the head with a hammer, for doing 428 in Puerto Rico, which is the program that allows for an estimated and a quick obligation. That's a huge win, and that's open up to states in every public assistance disaster. So that would allow even more flexibility on the how do you spend that. It's not a doorknob for doorknob. It's a, hey, we want to do this. Here's the estimate. Let's get this going. State and local governments operate on fixed cost estimates, construction estimates every day, so it's not new to them. So it's looking at the tools that are out there and kind of taking that adventure, stepping off what you used to do, and then stepping to something of what needs to be done. And then bringing all those community partners together. You got to have buy-in from the homeowners. You got to have buy-in from the faith-based community. You got to have buy-in from the various coalitions that are there advocating for those that need that help.
The short thing I would add is just from our experiences in New Jersey to make sure that there's a better effort to coordinate among agencies. So because for so long, issues like housing, environment, disaster planning, and recovery have been so siloed, it often feels like there's conflicting priorities or not a lot of alignment. So I would just encourage for there to be alignment both along those local or state scales and then more broadly nationally.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind everyone in the audience to start thinking and submitting questions you have for our panelists, because in a couple minutes we'll switch over and start taking audience questions. But right now, I'd just like to ask each of you before we do switch over, obviously we've just made it through an election. We have a new administration and we're looking at the next Congress coming into power. So what sort of big ideas do you have in terms of policy that we need to be able to build resilience? And what would you want to push if you could leave, the new administration, a new Congress with one or two big ideas? And Yvette, why don't we start with you? Because I know you guys in the housing space have already been leading with some big ideas throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, so Fair Share Housing Center really focuses on low-income people, particularly people of color. So I think one very important point going forward nationally is and also that's just been happening since the summer, since the pandemic, is really reckoning with the United States' racial history and understanding that when we make decisions, they should be done in a way that also is trying to dismantle segregation and inequality. So there's so many ways that the status quo is able to just perpetuate itself when we make decisions around where we're going to put a resilient, project and what neighborhoods get to have get recovery money. I know there was maybe it was about a year ago. The time's going by so fast, but there was that piece in NPR around FEMA recovery and how it often is helping wealthier, whiter homeowners. It tends to help wealthier, whiter homeowners. So I think on a large scale, we need to think about citing recovery programs, decisions, reconstruction in a way that decreases segregation and protects harm by future disasters in these marginalized communities, which often tend to be in environmentally vulnerable and precarious locations.
I think one of the most important things that we need as a nation, particularly for the federal family, is a comprehensive national resilience framework. I know FEMA is doing some efforts along those fronts. There needs to be someone that is setting a national perspective on what we're trying to accomplish, what's encompassed in this conversation, and truly drive the breakdown of those stovepipes, because there are so many diverse programs, diverse requirements that absolutely, to Jeff's point, need to be streamlined, simplified, coordinated. It is really a challenge, and it's a tremendous administrative burden on the state and local level that at times becomes untenable and frustrating. I love that Yvette has continued to say how much equity has to play into this. We have now got to look at how actually investments and mitigation can drive disaster assistance to be more equitable. I think that there is a tremendous opportunity there through investments in mitigation and driving federal investments to traditionally vulnerable, underserved populations can actually tremendously balance some of the historical imbalances within disaster assistance. I think that finally, one of the things that we really do need to look at is how we continue to incentivize the right behavior. We are a country that is loath for sticks. So we need a lot more carrots because people still make bad decisions every day because they're uninformed or they just truly believe it'll never happen to me. And so how do we drive those incentives, whether they're through individual and business tax incentives, through providing more resources to making it easier to invest in these things? Unfortunately, the only time we have the country's attention is in the wake of catastrophe. And so we need to leverage their attention and try to continue to incentivize the right behavior and try to remove some of those perverse incentives, if you will, to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I would echo both sentiments. I mean, to Yvette's point, there is disaster inequality. A lot of that has to do with a long history of how communities were planned and developed, and where housing's they're in flood zones, or they're there's a difference there. Team Rubicon, we work in those areas. That's where we target to do our work, is in the areas of high social vulnerability. And to Pam's point, I think pass a national law that would ban air conditioning 50 miles from the coast. That would stop people from moving. That's a joke. I don't know who all's on the panel, but very hot in the south, on the Gulf Coast, people wouldn't live there without air conditioning. I look at things that are also right in front of us, and I go back to really just that emergency manager. We will be in an opportunity, very, very soon to administer vaccines to 330 million people. We got to be unified in that. That's got to happen. That's not going to wait on transitions. That's not going to wait on, nominations and confirmations and all that. So we've got to be ready to go to that, because until we solve for that, everything that this panel wants to get done from a resilience standpoint is not in anybody's mind. So we've got to solve for that and then focus on, I don't think anybody, Democrat, Republican, you pick it, would say, you know what, I don't want to be more resilient. I would rather not be resilient. It's there. It's just to Pam's point, how do we get that in the equal footing of a response? How do we get that in an equal footing of the, recovery frameworks? How do we look at that as if we invest in that, the other frameworks may not be needed as much? So all in favor of both what Pam and Yvette just laid out.
Perfect. And thank you all. And I think this is a great transition to move over to the audience questions. And just a reminder to everyone in the audience to keep submitting questions. So I'll start with a question from Athena that I'm sure is on a lot of people's mind, which is, how do you see climate change impacting your work? And are there pre-disaster investments in infrastructure that can minimize risk related to climate change?
I can go first. So I think in New Jersey, we think a lot about climate change in the sense that there will be shifting housing dynamics and and generally we already advocate for affordable housing throughout the state in wealthier communities as well. And so I think when we prepare for changing housing dynamics, part of that is the housing stock, making sure that there's affordable housing in more inland areas and getting ready to see gentrification in these more inland towns. I forget the other part of the question. I can't see it anymore. But
I think it's what can we do there? Are there investments we can make? Is there infrastructure we can do to minimize the risks related to climate change?
Yeah, so because the data is so important, I think understanding where there is repetitive loss right now, and then it's a tricky process to think about relocating communities. So I think maybe understanding the dynamics on the ground through community organizing, nonprofits, and I think relocation and moving away from certain vulnerable areas is going to become more of a topic of discussion in the future. But having the data to know what's happening and what has happened over the last decade or two is really important throughout the country, not just in New Jersey. So we understand where to prioritize and what to really focus on in our efforts to be more resilient.
Great. And I'll move us to an interesting question from Bradley, which is, how can customer experience initiatives from the federal government work to improve collaboration during disasters? And Jeff, maybe I'll ask you to take that one first.
Yeah, how does customer experience initiatives help the federal government? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think how can we use maybe the insights from those customer experience initiatives to improve the way the federal government coordinates during disasters and the experience folks have?
Yeah, so I think that when you think about FEMA in this sense, they coordinate. FEMA is one entity that does provide, assistance after disasters. There's many other agencies, HUD, SBA, there's depending on if there's, other legislation passed that goes down. I think again that, you have to look at the state and local governments. You have to look at, FEMA gets asked to do a lot of things, and we have to understand they're guided by laws that are passed by the legislature, passed by the Congress, and then they have to enact those laws. There's nobody, I don't think, at FEMA that would say, yeah, we just need one system that we can support and coordinate this. But SBA has their set of laws, the HUD, the CDBG, disaster grant programs, a total other entity that gets wrapped into that. So I think the customer experience for an individual is something that everybody at FEMA strives to have it being the best they can be. I don't know anybody that would say, yeah, we want to not have a good one of this. I think it starts again at the local level. Change the laws, right? Change the laws that will put these agencies together in a certain way, or that will force these agencies just in simple timelines. CDBG-DR takes so long to get down to the need. And then it complicates housing because the IA, individual assistance program, is out the door. Then you got to battle, well, did you get this grant? And now you got this grant. Now you're not eligible for this grant. Just simplify timelines would help. A simple fix. But that's got to be some changes. And I think at the local and state level, force those changes into the Congress, and then FEMA will enact, and the other federal agencies will put those in process. But it's not as easy as some may think of just saying, well, just work together. It's a authority issue, it's a legal issue, and it's a timing issue.
Absolutely. And I'll bring us back now to a question we got earlier around some of the politics and disagreements that emerged during the development of BRIC. And we'll give this interesting question to Pam, since I think she's one of the best placed people in the country to be able to answer this.
Thank you. Thank you. So one of the most amazing things about the topic of disasters and emergency management, it's wholly a nonpartisan question. Disasters impact red and blue states. We have to work with people of all political perspectives to get assistance to people and help them recover from disasters. So thankfully, this topic comes from fundamentally a place of common ground, right? We are truly able to shift this policy because ultimately it comes down to wanting to help people recover from disasters. Now, when it comes to investment, particularly pre-disaster, which is difficult because there's a limited pot of money, and everyone, both sides, are very, very concerned about money and where the money goes and how quickly it's going to be spent. And most importantly, are we going to get a return on that investment? And here is where the data and the experts were critical to winning this conversation. Thanks to the National Institute of Building Sciences, we know, are you ready? We get an 11-to-1 return on investments in adopting building codes, a 6-to-1 return on federal grant programs. I don't know about how your investments are doing. That's a pretty good return on your investment. So also the law requires that FEMA's programs do have to be proven with data, risk reducing and cost effective. That's huge. That's huge. So folks were told, here is the data. We see what is happening with the rising trajectory of disaster costs and losses. We know that these are wise investments, and we are requiring that they get a huge return on that investment and that be proven upfront. And that made us tremendously successful and able to truly mark this area of common ground and get a lot of consensus and collaboration. I will tell you on the climate change piece too, FEMA and emergency managers are consequence managers. They look at impacts. And so again, through the tremendous amount of data that has been coming in on impacts and projected impacts, emergency managers are able to make informed decisions. Planners are able to make informed decisions. I cannot speak to causes of climate change. I am not focused on issues of adaptation and carbon emissions, but I am wholly and completely focused and committed to how do we draw down those impacts. So that is really where we've been able to kind of avoid some of the more polarizing topics around disaster impacts.
Great. Well, I think we have time for one last question, which is submitted by Maron, which is around NFIP, which I know is a big topic of discussion. So as we all know, NFIP is $20 billion in debt, and some say that debt is due to Americans living in riskier neighborhoods. Others argue that the flood rate maps are long outdated. The question we have is, what are your thoughts and what do you think we can do to help make NFIP more fiscally sound? I know this is a big topic, but since we're in our last couple of minutes, would be great if maybe folks just want to give their quick takes around maybe the most important driver or two and one thing we could do to make it more fiscally sound.
I will just say very quickly that the National Flood Insurance Program must be aligned to the policies and requirements of other disaster programs. There are not identical building standard requirements. There are not identical impact requirements. And until we have a big policy discussion on the future of the National Flood Insurance Program and how it fits in driving individual behavior throughout the disaster life cycle, we are not going to solve this
Perfect. Well, I think that that's a great note to end on. Thank you to our panelists, and especially thank you to BPC for hosting this event and to everyone in the audience for listening and submitting questions.